Hi, everyone. Um, the reason I felt it important to do a book essay, because that's what it is, on the Obama administration, is because I think it's extremely important for progressive people not to create too many illusions about what's around, because they don't help. And to see in quite a hard-headed way what this new administration is, what it represents in terms of foreign policy, imperialist continuity, and what it represents at home. And it's important to do that to understand to what extent it's different and to what extent it is continuing the policies of the previous three administrations, not just Bush and Cheney, but Clinton and Bush Sr. And from that point of view, the balance sheet I have prepared, the Obama syndrome, war abroad, and surrender at home, is not a very optimistic account or a pleasing account of this administration. Now, it's not a pleasant task to write books like this, because, you know, when you see what's going on and read a lot of material which has been published on domestic policies, leave alone on foreign policies, it's striking how conservative the administration has been. Now, I know all the restraints and constraints. I know that we live in a neoliberal period, that despite the crash of 2008, the system and its political leaders have not attempted any serious structural reforms which was, necessary after that crash. And so the crash has not gone away. It's simply been plastered over with sticking plaster. And it is going to worry people and is worrying certainly progressive economists, many of them who are not that radical, who are saying that it's not going to work. So here was an opportunity for a newly elected president who was not responsible and couldn't be held responsible for this particular economic crash, who had, unlike previous presidents, mobilized hundreds of thousands of young people in this country, brought them out into the streets to help him get elected, and had created the illusion that they would do something. I mean, yes, we can is not a very concrete slogan, but it offers some hope, or at least creates the impression of offering hope. And so young people were happy, they were mobilized, and they thought that some change would take place abroad and at home. The balance sheet is what? Let's first discuss briefly the continuity in foreign policy. Now, the continuity in foreign policy was symbolized by keeping Gates on at the Pentagon, by essentially accepting the view that Petraeus' surge in Iraq had solved the problem, by sticking to Bush's plans on a so-called withdrawal from Iraq without bringing about any change there at all, by pushing these plans through, which are essentially very simple: withdrawing combat units from the main cities of Iraq, building huge military bases in that country, and keeping between 50 and 70,000 troops there permanently. That is what the withdrawal is, and it's not new. The British tried it in the 20s and 30s, exactly the same plan, and it imploded when there was a revolution in Iraq in 1958. And they had to, they threw the British out. And it's very likely in some shape and form, not in the shape and form of the 50s, but a similar thing will happen if these troops stay in there. On Iran, once again, this administration has carried on with the old policies, essentially in the case of Iran, appeasing the Israelis. Because the big pressure for not doing any deal with Iran, both on the nuclear question and generally on other issues, comes from the Israelis, who are prepared to do anything to preserve their own nuclear monopoly. That is what that particular issue is about. And the failure of this administration to break with those policies of the previous administration is not all that surprising, because I remember, as I point out in the book, I was in the Midwest teaching for 4 weeks in Urbana-Champaign, and I saw this young, fresh-faced guy running for the Senate called Barack Obama. And I was at a house of friends, and they said, he is the great hope of the Democrats. And I said, well, let's watch him, because I'm always interested in great hopes. And the great hope was asked, President Bush has said that it might be necessary to bomb Iran and take out their nuclear installations or whatever they're doing, and what would be your position on that? I support the president totally, said the great hope. So that was my first sighting of him, and I just felt instinctively that this is a guy who is really going to try to please, and he is a weak guy in many ways, and is not going to push through some tiny shifts in domestic or global policies. If on Iraq and Iran he made slightly different noises and pretended to switch on to a different mood music, in Afghanistan the message was very different. We're going to escalate the war. We're going to send more troops. The war was renamed not the war in Afghanistan or the war on terror. It was called AFPAC, unifying two countries as part of American strategic thinking. And they've kept their promises on that. They have escalated the war. More and more Afghans are being killed. More US soldiers are being killed. More NATO soldiers are being killed. More Pakistanis are being killed. One of the more grotesque episodes in recent history is that in a part of Sindh where they desperately needed to use the Shahbaz Air Base for helicopters to get relief to the flood victims, because 100,000 flood victims were in a neighboring town being threatened by the water, the government, the health department of the Pakistan government was told that base is no longer available because it is being used by the United States to fire drones against villages in other parts of Pakistan. So this picture of a continuity in foreign policy and an escalation in South Asia is not a very promising one. And there are no excuses for it. The notion that this was a good war, whereas Iraq was a bad war, was always a flawed notion. And now that has become clear. And the destabilization that this is causing now, both the war and the uncritical support of the United States for the elites in Pakistan, is now creating havoc in that country. I have never known it in all the time I've been living in it, writing about it, to be in such a bad state. It is one of the most depressing periods in the history of that particular country, and at the moment there seems to be no solution. In the case of Israel-Palestine, once again, like every other president before him, he declared that we have to bring both sides together. Well, interesting. I mean, you bring both sides together to do what? And it's not worked in the past. This time, the same policies are being tried in a situation where the Israelis have expanded their frontiers yet again, where you've had a war on Gaza backed by the West, given the green light by the European Union and the United States, front of the great Western citizens, many of whom protested, but by and large not all that much. And now what is being done is a deal to totally put the Palestinians on their knees and get them to accept tiny little statelets which essentially will be Western Israeli protectorates in some form or the other. The elected government of that region has been totally ignored because it was elected against the will of the Western governments. So this is how democracy is applied abroad. It's a bleak picture, and the one hope that was expressed by South American leaders, this new wave of radical democratic politicians like Evo Morales, Hugo Chavez, all these people who've been elected, is that at least they would shift away from an aggressive strategy in South America. That too has not happened. Soon after a pledge or a semi-pledge that they were not going to do too much, there was a coup in Honduras, clearly masterminded by the State Department and Hillary Clinton. You had more pressure, not that too much pressure was needed, on the Colombians to build yet another US military base in that region. I mean, how many military bases do they need in that region to deal with the drug problem, for God's sake? I mean, why not in Mexico? You know, I mean, on the basis of what they're building in Colombia, they should build 100 military bases in Mexico. But that's not about drugs. It creates one country which, in that region, remains solidly with the United States and accepts US foreign policy unquestioningly, whereas all the others, to one degree or the other, including Brazil, which they are very angry about in the West, has not gone along with US policies. So the picture abroad is one of continuity, and it's going to get worse in many parts of the world. The US presence there is not going to make things better. On the domestic front, there was big debate for many, many years on this important issue of health, a big debate. And, you know, I'm not going to read them out, but the disappointment of many, including many who served in previous administrations, like Robert Reich, like the nurses' trade union, pointing out that the healthcare reforms, while obviously marginally a small step forward, they hope and we hope, nonetheless, in terms of failing to break with the insurance companies. In fact, the bill was drafted by someone who had worked for the insurance companies, was going to leave the United States with more money being spent on this type of health service via the insurance companies than is spent by any Western European country, where they have, as everyone knows, a much better health service, or the Canadians. So the US expenditure, state expenditure on health, exceeds that of all the Western European countries and Canada. And this is a form of essentially helping to sustain a very corrupt industry and of refusing to challenge another corrupt industry, which is the pharmaceutical industry. If anything was justified, it was to take it out of the control of these people and actually to follow some examples of producing cheap medicines, which the Brazilians, not to mention the Cubans, and in some cases even in countries like India, have been experimenting with for years. Clear thing. Okay, don't copy the Cubans, because, you know, that's always problematic for an American administration. But what about the Brazilians? Producing cheap medicines, breaking with international laws sometimes to produce cheap medicines for their population. The United States government could have done it. I cannot believe this would have been unpopular. And then to retreat and force poor old Denis Kucinich to retreat, saying my presidency is on the line if you don't vote for me. I mean, what is all this about? Is it about the health of the American people or your presidency? And forcing them to retreat so that there's basically been very little opposition, though there is anger. I know this from traveling in this country as to what has taken place. Now, people say, but what about these town hall gatherings, the right, all that? I don't ignore that. But most of the town hall gatherings in terms of numbers were very small. by and large. They were not huge gatherings. They were given enormous prominence by Fox Television and some of the networks, just, lifted to a height where they certainly were not. But then, even if they take place, how do you deal with them? You don't capitulate to that mood. Your constant boast has been that we have more supporters online than any other political party in the history of the United States. 13 million of our supporters are online. Good. Mobilize 500,000 of them to come out in front of the White House in Washington and say, we want a single-payer health service. That's the way to do it. To mobilize your support. You can do it to win elections, but you will not do it to engage with people politically and move forward. So that wasn't done. How this will work out still remains an open question, precisely because of the way it was done in relation to health. In terms of education, it's a disaster story. I mean, they have not only not broken with the Bush administration and its educational policies, they are taking them further. Here, mercifully, there's been some resistance from below that mayors and chief heads of education appointed to impose a neoliberal education system are being defeated. There was a defeat in Washington last week, precisely on the issue of education, presented by the, mainstream press as as retrogressive conservative opposition to reforms. One of the things that neoliberalism has done is given a new meaning to words. And someone should do a little book on the language of neoliberalism, where reform actually means counter-reforms, pushing back all the gains that have been made historically for 60 years. And there is real anger about the way in which neoliberal methods have been brought into education and used on the level of schools. And there's a very interesting book by Diana Ravitch, who was Under Secretary of Education in the Reagan administration, saying, I used to believe in all this nonsense till I went out and studied it, and it's a disaster. And she explains really graphically what has been going on in the country. I mean, if anyone in the Obama administration had the sense, and they should have read that book and actually used it to try and bring about change. On the contrary, they go on. And Daley and the Democratic gang running Chicago, what are they trying to do? They are now trying to sell schools to who? Companies we know. But they are now saying it would be a good idea if schools could be bought by the US Army, the US Navy, the US Air Force, because you see there is an unemployment problem for our kids, and if they bought them, they would help out with employment. Right. That has been said. I.e., we can't afford to have conscription legally because it would, creates too many problems, but let's do it behind the scenes. Let's sell some of our schools to the armed forces, and there will be a transmission belt from these schools straight into the Army, Navy, and Air Force. This is essentially what is going on. If you look at what has happened on civil liberties, the small but important promises made, Guantanamo will be closed down. Like hell it has. Torture and rendition are a problem. Torture and rendition defended by the new appointee to the Supreme Court. Defended by Mr. Coe, head of the Yale Law School, who opposed it under the Bush years, but now is defending it and defending drone attacks, saying that these do not violate international law. So it's a grim situation. And it's a situation which essentially, to me, shows that apart from for purely, sort of cosmetic things, there has been very little break with the administration that preceded it, and what is frightening is that so many people are not prepared to say so. Look, we have now got a colored president in the White House, a mixed-race president, so that novelty is worn off. One can't, it's an important thing that it happened, it's good, it had symbolic value, but what other value does it have which isn't reflected in political and social policies? And after all, it's not the case that senior Afro-Americans have not been appointed to the administration. The Bush people were, very clear on that. Condi Rice, National Security Council, Colin Powell, Secretary of State, Clarence Thomas, a former Black Panther supporter, first employed by, you didn't know that? Yes. Employed first by the Reagan administration and then promoted for his loyalty to the Supreme Court. So they do it. And they don't do it on the basis of race, they do it on the basis of politics. These people are with us politically. And I think from our side, we have to see it like that too. Judge people on the basis of their politics, what they do. That is extremely important if something is going to grow out of here. The last point I want to make is that this shift in global politics that we are seeing, the United States is one variant of it, but don't think that you're alone. The whole of Europe and other parts of the world, India for instance, are suffering from exactly the same thing. This is a neoliberal political model. There is no alternative. Center-left or center-right are different gangs with different clientele, with different people they want to promote, with the same lobbyists in most cases, and the same Wall Street in most cases, which gives money to both sides, but by and large, which don't do things that are too different from each other. We've seen this in Britain with 10, 12 years of the new Labour government, which carried on with Thatcherism, so that when you have a conservative government elected with a liberal people in coalition, and they're pushing through cuts, when they're attacked, they say, well, these are the same cuts Labour was going to push through. We've got the paperwork, we've seen it. That is what they were going to do, and that's true. They were going to do it. In France, the difference between the policies, economic policies of Sarkozy and the Socialist Party are not that different. In Germany, you've had coalition governments between the two big parties, defending the same social and economic policies. Italy is a disastrous situation, where Berlusconi, who's a clown, his successor is likely to be Fini, someone in direct lineal descent from Mussolini, politically. You have a rise of a populist new right everywhere in Europe, targeting Islam usually and migrants, because most of the migrants they hate happen to come from Muslim countries, except in France where they've started targeting the Roma people, the traveling people. But there they target Islam and migrants from the Maghreb too, but it's easier to get rid of the Roma first. So it's not a pleasant atmosphere. So the Tea Party here, which is slightly different from all these fascist groups, by the way, because most of these groups of the extreme right are descended from the fascist groups of the 20s, 30s, 40s. And they've changed, but those are their origins. The Tea Party is a strain of populism, usually right-wing, which has been on the fringes of the Republican Party for a long, long time. You had it during the Kennedy administration. It was known as the John Birch Society. You had it during the Roosevelt period. They were called Sons of Liberty or something like that. So you have had this fringe, which comes to the fore whenever there's a democratic government in this country. The Tea Party is more important than that because it is on the verge, it seems, of making big, big gains inside the Republican Party, which the others didn't succeed in doing. I mean, the closest they got to it was Goldwater as a candidate they supported against Johnson, but they never got close to it. The other thing which shouldn't be forgotten is occasionally some of these right-wing populist groups raise questions which the left shies away from. The bailouts here, the question of working class living standards, which then they use in a racist way. Of course we know that, but which are nonetheless not unimportant questions. I was saying to Rick earlier, when I was in Germany, a trade union leader said to me, "You tell us what to do, Herr Ali." I said, "Why?" They said, "All the laundry Just to give you one example, from all the hotels in Berlin, which used to be washed here by Germans, and he said, when I say Germans, I mean German citizens, I don't mean white people. It used to be washed in Berlin and offer employment, and he gave me the figures. I mean, they were not huge, but, you know, not unimportant. He says now all this linen is just sent across the border to Poland, where they do it for half the price, which means we have unemployment. What are we to do? I said, well, you know, what I'm going to say is a bit trite, but this is the system. So, you know, one can't totally ignore the systemic side of this, that the whole creation of a neoliberal European Union is designed precisely for this purpose. And by the way, this is why people voted against this union in France, in Ireland, in Holland, and in other places. There was a real class hatred of it, saying it's a bankers' union, it's not for us. So what we're seeing in the United States now is a US variant of what is taking place in the rest of Europe. Now that doesn't help us much, those of us who are active in this country, but it should be known. It's part of the pattern. The key thing is to realize what's going on, because unless you realize what's going on, it is very difficult to construct a hopeful opposition. Thank you.